Welcome to DEIJ Hot Takes. My name is Daryl Sinclair, and this is the podcast where we discover the bold and transformative ideas shaping diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice work today. In this episode, we are joined by Kit Marie Rackley, who is currently working at the University of East Anglia Tyndall Centre as their school's Climate Hub Coordinator for Climate Change Research. Kit Marie is an equity advocate in many spaces, such as decolonizing geography and in the University of East Anglia EDI committee. Kit Marie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi it's there. A pleasure to be here, Daryl.
So we're going to jump straight into it today. Could you please introduce to us your DEIJ hot take and how it helps you with your EDI work?
So my DEIJ hot take is that allyship is mostly performative and actually does more harm than good. And there's a lot I can say about that.
Yeah, that's a very strong statement, and there's a lot of work being done in that area. So it's interesting that that's your hot take. I have a lot of questions, but what I'm going to ask you to do, could you please take us through what this means? You know, why is it a hot take and how does it show up in the work that you do?
Right, so it's a hot take because as a member of the LGBTQ community, trans community, I do appreciate that allyship is very important and it's very powerful and it is something that is definitely needed for all of us. But it is a hot take because I've experienced firsthand, and as well as my friends and people in the community have experienced firsthand, of allyship actually doing a lot of damage because of its performativity. So, for instance, there's been a place of work where some right-wing folks have come on, and the people who worked at this place, did a counter protest and things like that. And when they asked the workplace, which has DEI policies and says we support our LGBT, they do Pride and they go on the Pride marches, but when this far right group kind of doing an anti-trans protest, for example, on their near their grounds, they didn't do anything about it or didn't say anything about it, and they basically just said we can't do anything about it because these people coming to say these things have freedom of speech, which is fine, which is okay, but having someone have freedom of speech doesn't necessarily contradict, your responsibilities to your employees who are members of certain communities, right? So that is just one example of many of performative allyship. And then you feel, if you're a member of that community and you're a member of that workforce, those employees, you feel let down. You don't feel that the values that you've bought into to that place is being reflected by the people that employ you. When you see their logo, their symbol, and during a June or July on their Twitter profile, and you see the pride flag behind their logo, it's meaningless, it's performative, and suddenly you feel like, what am I doing working for this place? Even though you might love your job, you start second guessing the nature, and that's a really bad, awful way to feel about things for a place that you've really invested yourself in and that you identify with, because a lot of us do identify with our work, you see. So that's where my hot take has really come from.
No, I really appreciate that, and thank you for the example. A quick question which comes to mind is, well, not a question, a statement. Freedom of speech is not freedom to harm. So there has to be a balance, and I love how you pointed out the responsibility to the community, which is very central to DEIJ work. So a question I might have, just to explore that a little bit further, is when you speak to the harm, is it more harmful in a situation where there's performative allyship, or is it the people who are opposing the inclusion? Because it sounds to me like that loss of trust is part of the harm which is taking place. Could you explore that a little more?
I guess this is like a secondary hot take from my primary hot take, and that is, if I thought about this more, obviously it's more nuanced, more complex, and there is more to it, and everybody is their own experience individually, and a lot of kind of misplaced allyship is usually grounded in misunderstanding or something like that. However, I guess it is a hot take, but one I do have to say that I actually feel that performative allyship is more harmful than actually, just dismissing it outright, or actually being, well, let's call it for what it is. If you are not an ally, if you're not anti-racist, if you're not anti-homophobic, then the opposite, the antipode of that is homophobic, is racist, right? Regardless of whether you realise you're being racist or homophobic or not, you've got institutional, structural, all that kind of stuff. I feel that those kind of things are more, they're visible, they're more overt, and therefore they're kind of like more easily identified and more easily, I wouldn't say dealt with, but more easily kind of countered, or more easily kind of, you can set policies against them, you can actually label them, you can actually go, whereas performative allyship it's more like a mist that you can't really clear. You're waving about trying to get rid of it. It just feels it again, right? It isn't something solid like something like racism or homophobia or transphobia, where you can clearly identify it, clearly label it, and clearly say, right, these are the steps we need to take to deal with it. Whereas performative allyship, there's so much grey. There's so much grey.
And can you give me an example of how this shows up in your work? So as you're approaching your work, ensuring the inclusion of the communities you're working with, what do you do to ensure that your allyship for other identities is authentic, is genuine, and having a positive impact? How does it influence your work?
Yeah, what a great question. I mean, working in the field of climate change, there is a huge amount that can be done. So the benefit that folks like me have who work in climate change, but also intersecting with education, because a lot of my work is education, climate change, communication, science communication, is that the science actually backs up the need for DEIJ, because, for example, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change quite clearly in their latest report say that structural change is needed to fight climate change. It's the most vulnerable in society that are needed, and we need a more just approach. We think something called climate justice. So you need to engage marginalised folks, but not only that, they need to be front and centre with the solutions and what we need to do to adapt and to become more resilient to climate change. So, for example, through my podcast, I will talk to folks like Dr. Keston Perry, who is an expert on how climate change initially actually was a colonial process. It was a colonial thing that happened because of land use change in Haiti, the movement of goods to Europe, and how that kind of like interfered with the natural processes that sunk carbon, etc., etc., etc. So if you don't tell those stories and allow those people to tell those stories and give them a platform, then I feel you're doing something like climate science and how to battle climate change a disservice. Indigenous folk, promoting the way that they are stewards of the land, listening to their stories, putting them in your lesson plans. And another thing I've done is I've got a soft spot for the country of Malawi. So Muli Wanji to anyone who can speak Chichewa out there. But I do a primary school activity about climate change in Malawi and how it affects farming. But a lot of it gets talked about, these are third world farmers and subsistence farmers, but actually it's not just like that. So it's then bringing in stories from friends that I know from Malawi about what's really happening and actually how they are fighting back. So for me, it's all about promoting their stories, making them human, and saying, I can only convey the story, but it should be these folks who should be telling the story. So that is just one example of many of the ways that I try and do that myself. And I don't see that as performative allyship because I may be trans, but I'm white and I'm European. I've got so much privilege, and I just feel that actually one of the best uses of that privilege is to pay it forward to those who don't have it. So, and I ask permission to tell these stories, rather than assuming that I've got permission to tell these stories.
Those are some brilliant points. The core sense of platforming people and giving your space, the privileged space you have for the use of people whose voices are marginalized, is true allyship, because there is an actual exchange of power, in a sense, or a sharing of power, rather than being extractive. So thank you so much for that, Kit Marie. What I would like, just if you've said some brilliant points, but I like to have just a little section at the end. Sure. Is there any quick key takeaway for our listeners, a key question they should consider when they're performing their, hopefully not performatively, but when they are doing allyship work, something that people can take away or explore more?
I would say very simply, look, allyship does make people feel uncomfortable, and that's what turns them off of it, because they worry they're doing it wrong, they're not doing it properly, or because you're engaging with things that are outside of your worldview or outside of your experience. What I would say to you folks is that is okay. Being uncomfortable is a human response. It's a normal response. So what you want to do is you want to sit with that discomfort yourself, be introspective. You don't have to talk to anybody if you don't want, if it's embarrassing, and just say to yourself, well, why do I feel uncomfortable? And then when you do that, you start coming up with questions. And when you've got questions, you can then start seeking the answers. And the people you want to seek those answers for are the folks who are making you feel uncomfortable. So if it's trans people like myself, there will be trans people out there who will be happy or have already put out there the answers or suggestions to those questions.
Thank you so much for such a brilliant take, a thoughtful discussion. For our listeners, I'm going to place links in the description where you can connect with Kit Marie, explore their ideas and their work, and go further with this, and maybe collaborate with Kit Marie. I've thoroughly recommend it. Thank you for watching or listening, and I will see you on our next episode of DEIJ Hot Takes. Thank you, Kit Marie.
Thank you, Daryl.